Hello, everyone. This is Mehdi Hassan, and this is a Zateo Live Town Hall for our paid subscribers. Thank you all for joining me and my guest today. I mean, sorry to start with this, but rape, grooming gangs, pedophiles, Muslims, Islam, Pakistanis. If you follow Elon Musk on Twitter, and 200 million people do, that's all you've been hearing about in recent days. Dissolve the British government. The king should get rid of the prime minister. Labour are complicit in gang rape. This is Elon Musk dredging up scandals from the last 10, 15, 20 years, heinous scandals, real scandals involving the child rape, the abuse, the grooming of young girls in towns across England. But Musk has decided in 2025 to make that a big wedge issue to try and topple a Labour government and to bring up all the old tropes about Pakistani Muslim rapists, et cetera, et cetera. We wanted to get to the bottom of this because you know what? There's a lot of people running their mouths who don't know what they're talking about. And who better to talk to about this and take your questions than my guest today from Manchester live, Nazir Afzal, who was the Chief Crown Prosecutor for the Northwest of England between 2011 and 2015. He worked directly under the then Director of Public Prosecutions, Keir Starmer, now Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. The New York Times described Nazir as the go-to prosecutor for issues of sexual violence and violence against women. He actually prosecuted some of these gangs. So let's talk to Nazir about all of this. Nazir, thanks so much for joining us on this Zateo Town Hall.
Mehdi, good to see you, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to spend some time with you.
Sorry, we have to talk under these circumstances because it's it's one of those things where we're all dancing to the tunes of the Elon Musk and Donald Trumps who create stories out of nothing. And look, again, to be clear, the underlying story is very real. There was a real scandal in the UK, real horrors against children. But the way that Musk has suddenly just made it the dominant story and insisted today, we're speaking on the day that Conservatives tried to have a vote in Parliament to have a new national inquiry into grooming gangs and Pakistani men, and it failed because Labour voted against it. So I'm just going to jump off with just a very obvious question. Elon Musk, Nigel Farage, the new leader of the Conservative Party, Kemi Badenoch, right-wing press in the UK are demanding a national inquiry into these scandals of young girls in northern towns like Rotherham and Rochdale, Oldham, being gang raped and groomed and trafficked over many years. What do you believe? Do you believe there should be another national inquiry?
No, because, I think you're quite right to say that I led the work on tackling sexual violence, not just in the northwest of England, but nationally for about 4 or 5 years at the beginning of the last decade. And that included this issue. In fact, I was the one that highlighted this issue because I brought the very first prosecution in Rochdale, which has been turned into a BBC film. And that prosecution changed, I think, people's thinking. It led such a significant and seismic change. I think you said it a moment ago, and I'll repeat it. These were horrific crimes. In the Rochdale case, 9 men over a period of 2 or 3 years raped and abused 47 girls, 6 of whom gave evidence in the trial. And they were horrific rapes, but they were very distinct from because generally when you're dealing with rapes, as I have done, you're looking for things like, did they return to the perpetrator? If they did, well, you should question whether they did or not. Or were they consistent? Well, some of them were so plied with drugs and drink, they weren't consistent. So all the usual tests that you would apply for these cases weren't really relevant. And it was quite significant that we had to change the way we worked. And we did change the way we worked. So Keir, the Prime Minister, as he is now, we changed policy, we changed practice, we changed the way the courts operated. And over a period of 3 or 4 years, Mehdi, we went from being okay at tackling sexual violence against children to producing the best outcomes in British history. And so when Musk and others are suggesting that somehow we were all complicit back then, it's clearly a political move. There's no other way about it, because the data, the experience of everybody who was around at that time and involved at that time will tell you that we improve things beyond all measure. But he can't say that. He wants to.
Well, he's saying explicitly the opposite. He's saying Keir Starmer was complicit in the mass rape of the UK.
He's using some quite horrific language.
Yes.
I think he called another minister a rape apologist.
Yes, Jess Phillips, who's now getting death threats as a result.
And so he's been very clear about how he wants to say it, but he's completely rewriting history. and doing so in such a way, quite frankly, which I think many people haven't recognized, is over the last week or so, this is the first broadcast interview I've done since Mr. Musk started talking. And that's because I've been listening to victims. Victims have been ringing me up and saying, look, you dealt with my case 15 years ago. I thought I was getting better. This last week, I have been re-traumatized.
Wow.
I have been re-triggered. I've believed myself to be back
because of Elon Musk's intervention.
Because of all of this, exactly. And I've got no services to go to. I got lots of wraparound support when the trial happened. Then I got better and I've improved my life and I've moved on. And now the last week or so, I can't sleep. My life is a mess. And that is entirely directly related to the furore that's been created across the pond in your part of the world. We're having to pick up the pieces of that. And it was done for all the wrong reasons. You know, had it been done to improve the life of victims, to ensure that their future victims don't occur, I'd be very supportive. Had it been done to ensure that more perpetrators were brought to justice, I'd be supportive. It's none of those things. It's simply, as you say, I used the wedge earlier on. It's simply a tool by which to attack minority communities in the UK and also the government of this country.
Just on the national inquiry, and it's fascinating but depressing to hear you saying what the victims are saying, and clearly they've been ignored with the obsession on perpetrators and their ethnicity, which we'll come to. Just on the national inquiry, just to be clear for people watching, Professor Alexis Jay held an inquiry 7 years long, cost £200 million, 468 pages, 20 recommendations, which I urge people to read. None of those recommendations were implemented by the Conservative government, which was in power for 2 years after her report came out. She also held, earlier in her career, did a separate report on Rotherham specifically. Interestingly, Liz Truss, who was outlasted by a lettuce as Prime Minister of the UK, was Prime Minister when the report came out. And right now, she's sitting on Twitter saying, how dare the British establishment cover this up? She was Prime Minister and she didn't do anything. So when people say
the only tweet she ever put up about grooming was in relation to a dog. A dog
that says everything.
A dog being groomed.
So Nazir, let me ask you this. When people say national inquiry, it sounds to people who are not following this, what could be wrong with a national inquiry?
Because we've had them. We know what needs to change. We need to bring in, and the government now committed, this government, new government, are committed to mandatory reporting. So if you see or hear or suspect something, you have to report it. If you don't, you will suffer a criminal consequence. That's the most significant recommendation. There were 19 others, as you pointed out. And there were other inquiries. You know, this is a national inquiry. There have been lots of local inquiries as well over the last decade. We know what needs to be done. And victim survivors have told me, do it. Yeah. Just don't spend another 7 years and another £200 million coming up with the same answers.
Well, one of the lawyers for the victims in Rotherham, whom I'm sure you've come across, David Greenwood, came out this week and said it would be a distraction. We've had enough inquiries. We need action, as you're saying. We're getting lots of questions from our subscribers. A lot of people in the chat. We've got over a couple of hundred people watching right now live. We obviously not going to be able to take all your questions, but I'm going to try and take some of your best questions to Nazir. Iftikhar Saraf says, Dear Nazir Afzal, you know more about this case than anyone else. Are you satisfied that everything that could have been done to catch the culprits was done? This is 10 plus years since the horror happened. Could a new inquiry make any difference at all in terms of catching people who weren't caught?
Because we've been catching them. If that's using your phrase, Iftikhar, every day you'll see somebody being charged in relation to something that happened in the years gone by. So people are being brought to justice. We've put an enormous, the government, the UK resources have gone into tackling this issue. Hundreds of people. I have put, as a British Pakistani Muslim, I have put more Muslims in jail than anybody else for this type of offending. And that's the way it should be, because they're criminals. But criminality begins and ends with the criminal. The whole community is not responsible for what these individuals did. We've done everything we possibly could, Iftikhar. And they have. This is not an issue about whether more resources could be offered or whether certain cover-ups are taking place. This is quite simply an issue about raising it, because they're not talking about the 88% of child sex offending that's carried out by British white men.
So let's talk about race and ethnicity, as you brought up. I do want to talk about cover-ups. We'll come back to that. Shagufta Slaughter, sorry, I do slaughter people's names, asks in the comments, why is it that often when these grooming gangs are referenced, there is specific reference to the Asian grooming gang, for example, in Rotherham, when the UK government itself has reported that the vast majority of these gangs are white? And I think that's a reference to a Home Office piece of research that came out in 2020, which suggested that the majority of people in grooming gangs, if we can use even that phrase, are white men under 30, not Asians. Although Asians do seem to be overrepresented in some towns, as we mentioned.
When I prosecuted the very first one I mentioned earlier on, it got acres of coverage in the UK and globally. The week after, I prosecuted 10 white men, and it got a paragraph in the Daily Mail. The reality is our failures, or the failures of people who look a bit like me or you, are amplified. That's not to deny or in any way minimize the terror that these people were responsible for, but it's also recognizing that the last government kept saying over and over again, it's brown men, it's brown men, it's brown men. That was really dangerous. Why it was dangerous, Mehdi? Because you're telling girls, beware the brown man, when 88% of sex offending is carried out by white men. So you're actually putting them in greater danger by simply choosing the ethnicity as the issue. The thing they all have in common, by the way, all the perpetrators, is they're men. And we don't have much of a conversation around misogyny and sexism and all the things that drive this type of behavior.
On just sticking on the ethnicity issue, the average person who's not, let's say an average British person, average American, anyone watching this, who's not on the far right, doesn't see themselves as a racist, but looks at Rotherham or Oldham or Telford, Rochdale, sees pictures, lots and lots of Asian faces staring out, and says, but why are they overrepresented in these towns, in these crimes? What is your answer to that question? Is it culture? Is it religion? No. Is it opportunity? I know some people have talked about the nighttime economy. A lot of these men were taxi drivers.
Well, you know, when I gave evidence to Parliament 13 years ago and said we should have some research, and there has been no research. So we're still all relying upon anecdote or guesswork. Some of the victims I spoke to back, you know, when it first happened, told me that because they had broken families, they had troubled backgrounds, they were out in the evenings and they were looking for warmth, they were looking for food, they were looking for mind-numbing substances, they were looking for somebody to love them. And these predators offered all of those things. And they happened to be in predominantly South Asian or Pakistani environments, taxi firms, takeaway restaurants, that kind of stuff. So yes, predators hide in those environments, as they have done some time immemorial. But whether or not, I mean, I thought maybe because we have continence of arranged marriage, whether that had an impact on it. You know, there are all sorts of factors that could possibly explain why these men do what they do.
Do you agree with some of the local reports, for example, in Telford, which say that local authorities didn't go harder after this? Police forces and officials didn't crack down because they were nervous about the racial aspect, because so many of the suspects and the accused and the perpetrators were brown men of Muslim origin, Pakistani descent. Do you buy that argument? You were at the heart of the prosecution.
Well, at the time, it was obvious to me that they were not dealing with crimes involving this cohort of young girls. As I've said before, ethnicity to my mind was an issue because of the disproportionate nature of men of brown background in these cases. But the main issue was the fact that these young girls were allowed to be abused and that people were not listening to them. In fact, some of the girls who were from very working class, impoverished backgrounds would say it was snobbery.
Yeah.
They were being looked down on by the authorities.
So it's class as well as race. It's the idea that they're white working class girls who were not seen as credible witnesses or people whose value. Yeah, it's an interesting point that we've ignored the class angle in this. But look, it's interesting. I did an interview with Piers Morgan today, which airs on Thursday, and I read out the list of, and I know you know these cases well, but there's a white grooming gang in Cornwall, prosecuted in 2010, in the West Midlands, prosecuted in 2023, also in Glasgow, also in 2023. We don't talk about those gangs, as you say, they're part of the 88%. And Piers Morgan said, well, we're not talking about those gangs. And I said, you've made my point for me. Why aren't we? And I just think the obsession with the race of the perpetrator only damages and undermines the victims. Because if we're talking about the perpetrator's race, then we're not really caring about the victims, regardless of their race. And I should also add, Nazir, is it true, and I read this in one of the reports, I think in the J report, citing a Muslim Women's Network report, that it's not true to say that all of these Pakistani men, British Pakistani men, focused only on white girls. The narrative is that they went after white young girls because they saw them as non-Muslim, cheaper, less valuable, less equal, easier to get, and they left Asian girls alone. That's not true. A lot of Asian girls were also
It's 100%
they just
not
didn't
true.
come
Again,
forward.
No, they did come forward. When I prosecuted the ringleader of the very first one, Rochdale, I also prosecuted him subsequently for his abuse of a Pakistani girl. He got 22 years in jail for that. So, but as you say,
we don't hear about that, Nazir. We only hear about brown men, white girls.
100%. And we should be hearing about South Asian or Pakistani or other victims. I think to some extent you're right, Mehdi, because of issues of honor and shame that we found historically there's a reluctance to report. And I think it's 3 times less likely to report abuse than white girls. And so there have been and there were victims from these backgrounds, these communities. But again, what we've been hearing over the last week in the United Kingdom and worldwide because of X and other platforms has not talked about the victims. There's nothing being said about victims other than using them as a tool to attack minoritized communities.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Sabah Shaukat asked the same question about the rhetoric in Asian communities that white girls are an easy target. Is the rhetoric from some people? Let's not make sweeping statements. And that's been fed now, this argument that a lot of this stuff is driven by that. But as you say, it erases Asian victims. Mirza Beg asks, what is the statistic behind the numbers being floated that there are thousands of such rapes that happened? What was the common background of these gangs? You've touched on some of that. On the numbers, Nazir, I saw Elon Musk, who started all of this, retweet a video of Lord Pearson, the former UKIP peer, saying millions of girls were raped. I mean, I feel like people are just inflating whatever they want to make the point.
Yeah.
Surely not.
Yeah, I think it's a competition, isn't it? The reality, that's just absolutely ridiculous. And we know that the only data that we do have, official data, was which told us that actually more than 3.1 million British adults were raped as a child. So a significant number, 1 in 20 Britons were raped as a child. That's not different, though. In the United States has a similar figure. I think it's 1 in 20. But the millions, people it's just competition to make it sound worse than it is.
Sabah also asked, the British press say 80% is done by Pakistani grooming gangs. Have they fiddled these figures? How do we debunk these figures? I mean, I read somewhere, Nazir, that the problem is not that it's 88%. I know there's a report doing the rounds, I think, for the Centre for Sexual Abuse, Expertise in Sexual Abuse, the CSA Centre, which a lot of people have been sharing the graphic online, which shows white people make up 83% or 82% of the population of England, Wales, are 88% of child sex abuse defendants. Asians make up 9% of that population, are 7% of defendants. So they're actually underrepresented versus white people. But even those statistics, all of that is very inadequate, right? Because a lot of police forces haven't recorded the ethnicity of perpetrators or victims.
Absolutely. And that was a recommendation made 10 years ago, by the way, Mehdi. The police officers, the data is inconsistent, the collection of it is inconsistent, and even the wrong definitions. We've talked about grooming gangs today. I also call them paedophile gangs. I also call them child sex rings. Because of the nature of the definitions, we can't really, we're comparing apples with pears. And that's why it's impossible to get a picture. But there has been, over the last 14 years of the last government, no progress on all the recommendations that we made in report after report.
You mentioned, Nazir, earlier that you're a Muslim. You're the child of Pakistani immigrants. You grew up in Birmingham, I believe, in a working class house. You know all of these communities that we're talking about. Atif asks, why are leaders of Muslim communities not coming out and condemning what happened? The timing is key here, is it not? What's your view on that?
They are, but they don't have the oxygen of publicity. They don't have Zatir or any other media channel to do it. When it first blew up 12, 13 years ago, every imam in every mosque in the United Kingdom did a Friday sermon talking about this subject. Leaders have spoken about this. I have spoken incessantly about this. So it has, but they don't necessarily get the oxygen of being able to talk about this in the media. They don't get called in. If they're called in, they're brought in next to some racist for a little battle.
Yes. Also, of course, I mean, a couple of things there. Number one, I find this argument that it's Islamic absurd, because even the most ignorant person knows that Muslims don't drink alcohol. So even before you even get to the horrific child rape, the idea that these gangs were plying girls with alcohol and drugs, not Islamic. I think it's fair to say. Most people would agree with that.
I think somebody called it a sexual jihad or something. The reality is these people are as far removed from Islam as you could possibly imagine. They're not going around with copies of the Quran. They're doing everything that they're not permitted to do. In Islamic firms, it would be haram. And they would face, in some countries, significant penalties, which would not involve them waking up the next day. So I think from my perspective, again, it's throwing everything into the pot, hoping that some of it will stick.
And of course, there is a broader point, which is whether Muslim leaders are heard or not, whether they did Friday Jummah sermons condemning this or not. The expectation that Muslim leaders have to condemn this is in and of itself, I think, bigoted and stereotyping, because, as I say, a bunch of white people abused children in Cornwall, in the West Midlands, in Glasgow. I could go on, and we haven't asked church leaders or white community leaders to condemn them. It's only ever brown Muslims who are asked to do that. And that leads me to
I prosecuted one guy who was a member of a far-right organization. That far-right organization said, well, we've cancelled his membership. And I said, well, hang on a minute, I can't cancel the membership of all these Muslims. So why are you tarring me with these criminals? But you can distance yourself from one that actually shares your values.
And on that note, Ghazal Amir asks, would you agree that a reason for all of this recent focus on the ethnicity of perpetrators is to damage Muslim communities in the UK and globally? What do you think is motivating Elon Musk?
Well, what do I know? I'm not a politician. I can say one thing, though. Europe is going very strong on regulation of social media platforms. In the United Kingdom, we've got a new Online Safety Act, which potentially can punish platforms that don't deal with misinformation with 10% of their global turnover. France and Germany and others are doing the same thing. Surprisingly, he's having a go at France and Germany. So my sense is maybe it's business. I don't know. But whatever the motivation is, you're absolutely right that it is targeting Muslim communities. We've had a significant spike in Islamophobia over the last year or two, or way before that as well. But I mean, I don't care what the excuses are. He has to stop. We have to challenge it. I don't like being on X. I'm on X, but I'm only there to put facts out. Because if I wasn't there putting facts out, then all you would get is misinformation.
It's a good point. And I would point out there's Robert Turfs says, thanks to each of you here in Florida. Robert joins us from Florida. We have Matt Gaetz. Maybe Mr. Musk needs to be directed here. Robert, it's a great point. I've made this point as well. The idea that Elon Musk cares about the victims of sex crimes and trafficking is ironic, given he supported Donald Trump for president, who was found liable for sexual abuse by a jury of his peers, given he has supported Matt Gaetz for attorney general, who a House Ethics Committee said they found substantial evidence that he had slept with a 17-year-old girl. He denies that, of course. So it's ironic when you hear Elon Musk claiming to care about, and other conservatives claiming to care about this stuff. Just on the politics of it, Keir Starmer came out and spoke this week to defend himself, to defend Jess Phillips. There was a vote in Parliament today, Wednesday, to dismiss the idea of a national inquiry. Tricia Scott asks, is it possible for the recommendations from the Alexis J. Independent Inquiry on Child Sexual Abuse, the IICSA, is it possible for those recommendations to be implemented while another national inquiry takes place to avoid a delay?
No, because what if this new national inquiry, I mean, not that it will, but another national inquiry means everything stops. Because we need to find out whether or not we've got this right. And 7 years down the line, the 200 million pounds that we've already spent on the inquiry, the enormous 7,000,
which Boris Johnson said was a waste of money, I should add.
Well, exactly that. 7,000 people, survivors and victims, gave their evidence to this inquiry. No other inquiry or new inquiry is going to add anything of any note. We know what works. It's already working when we've implemented bits of it. We just need to get on with it now.
Michael Flower says, what do you see as an effective strategy to fight against this resurfacing of past events for perverse political gains? This Musk attack is absolutely maddening. I mean, as you say, you began by saying people are calling you up saying they're getting PTSD, basically, survivors from this. You yourself covered this over a decade ago. And suddenly these people are acting like they've just discovered the moon.
I've spoken about it for 15 years. They're speaking about it for not even 15 days so far. Yes. And then there are all their followers, or lots of their followers, who seem to know more about this than I've ever known. And yet I've prosecuted thousands of these cases. I haven't told many. I suffered massive personal costs. I was attacked myself. My home was attacked by the far right 10 years ago.
Sorry to hear that.
My children could only go to school in the taxis because of the security advice we were given. I had panic alarms in my home, all because the far right suggested in their fake news that somehow I was part of the problem rather than the man that was delivering the solution. So it doesn't matter, even when we're getting things right, even when we're doing all the right things, they're still going to come for us. And, it's sad to say that's where we are. A lot of the question earlier about, whether community leaders should speak up, some of them are scared to do so because they put their heads above the parapet, they get shot down.
Mira Husseini says that Elon and his backers are just trying to incite civil war in the UK, and I think that's a fair point. Sadly, this is the world we live in. He's promoting Nazir. He's promoting Tommy Robinson, who is a man most UK people know to be a thug, a football hooligan, an Islamophobic, racist. He's in prison for defaming a 15-year-old Syrian refugee boy who was bullied in school. He then repeated that slander after a judge told him not to. He was then in prison for contempt of court. Meanwhile, Elon Musk is going around tweeting "Free Tommy Robinson." Tommy Robinson has never done anything to help expose
he has
these
not
crimes. In fact, he almost jeopardized a trial, didn't he?
Exactly. Not one single person has been successfully convicted based on his reporting. As you quite rightly point, on 2 occasions he was sentenced by the court because he, in effect, tried to intimidate jurors or to try and prejudice a case by demonstrating outside of a courtroom. So, in effect, he nearly stopped groomers or criminals or abusers from being convicted. And as you quite rightly pointed out, several convictions for football violence, assaulting off-duty police officers. He even entered America on a false passport. And I don't know how Musk can put him forward as some kind of saint or something. Mortgage fraud, contempt of court. He literally has done nothing for victims other than to gratify himself and earn some money off it.
And as Farhat Hussein points out in the comments, Musk and Jordan Peterson and others painting him as a political prisoner, which is absurd. In fact, I believe Musk's father compared him to Nelson Mandela. So I guess Musk is not the dumbest of Musks. Maybe
only yesterday, Mehdi, he received a $30,000 donation from Tristan Tate, who's the brother of Andrew Tate,
who himself is accused of trafficking and rape.
Both facing charges of human trafficking, rape, and making
ironic.
underage girls.
Let me ask you this. David Greenwood, who I mentioned earlier, who was a solicitor, lawyer for the Rotherham victims, and he said, no need for another inquiry. We need to implement what we have. I think he knows his stuff more than Elon Musk. He also said after the Rotherham trial that he heard evidence, he saw evidence in the trial, in the investigation, that police in Rotherham were exchanging money and drugs with some of these gangs and perpetrators, that there was collusion between police and rapists. You obviously were involved in the criminal justice law enforcement side, not as a police officer, but as a prosecutor. A, did you see evidence of that in any of the cases you prosecuted? And B, we keep hearing that the police forces were too politically correct. They didn't want to make Asians look bad. It's like British police in the north of England are not known for being liberal, sandal-wearing, muesli-eating, politically correct folks. I feel like the corruption, collusion line probably explains police inaction more than the political correctness line. What do you think?
I don't think it's anything about political correctness at all. I think to my mind, people love a conspiracy when it's just incompetence. What I think we found here is the police officers didn't understand what they were doing. And I didn't see any examples of corruption as described a moment or two ago.
But Nazir, we've seen reporting of girls going to a police station being ignored by the police, and then a gang member turns up at the police station to take them away. Someone tipped them off, surely.
Well, what I do remember, Mehdi, is that when I asked the police, why didn't you know where these girls were when the predators knew where they were? And so there are questions that need to be asked and have been asked by various inquiries. We've never, but the point I'd like to make is a national inquiry would not uncover that. What you need is a police inquiry. Our equivalent to the FBI, the National Crime Agency, should be doing that kind of thing.
That's a good point.
Because ultimately that's how you bring people to justice. But and my sense, to be honest with you, was a lack of competence. These are very difficult cases. Very often the victims would go back to their perpetrator rather than go to the police.
Vaseem Gova asks a broader question, which also Musk has touched on. Musk has brought up Jimmy Savile, the BBC host and presenter, one-time legend, now ghoul. He's dead, accused of hundreds and hundreds of horrific sex crimes against children. Vaseem Gova asks, is it true that Keir Starmer when he was a prosecutor, blocked investigations against Jimmy Savile? And if true, doesn't this go back further than even Rochdale?
No, I thought we debunked all of these things with facts. What the Savile case was, Savile had been abusing for 30 odd years. Various prime ministers and monarchs had been befriended him. When it finally came to about a couple of years before his death, 4 women made allegations about him to different police forces. The police forces didn't speak to each other. As a result of that, each of the women said, well, I can't go against this very powerful figure on my own. As a result, Savile was not prosecuted, and Savile ultimately died and was too late to prosecute. Keir Starmer had nothing to do with that. There was another inquiry. The Levitt inquiry in 2013 completely exonerated Keir Starmer, but then again, who cares? Nobody believes these things anymore.
What is your, actually, before I get to that, Noah Hudson asks, what can I say to my non-political friends who believe the headlines and social media posts? How can I convince them that Musk is politically dangerous and not some harmless businessman? I mean, Noah, what I would say, and I've dealt with this with family members, friends, people who love their Teslas and think, Musk is harmless. No, I think you have to point out some of the stuff he said and done. Really, really extreme stuff, especially in recent days. Elon Musk has written an article in a German newspaper in German endorsing the neo-Nazi aligned German party, the AfD. Like, that's as extreme as you can get. A party that even the French far-right Marine Le Pen don't want to touch, Musk is now boosting. So I think you have to explain to your friends that he may have been 10 years ago some wannabe Tony Stark, Iron Man, inventor. Today, he's just a far-right troll who says absolutely horrific, conspiratorial, racist, Islamophobic things. Just this week, he retweeted a post suggesting that Islamophobia is a fiction. So he's ticking every single far-right box. And I think we have to make that clear to people, because people who are not online don't follow this stuff terminally like some of us do. Yeah, they think, oh yeah, Elon Musk, the guy who makes electric cars. That's who he was. That's not who he is now. A question I would ask this to you, Nazir, from Imran Farouk. Is this new quote-unquote campaign against Pakistanis vis-a-vis the Muslim community and gangs much like the so-called war on terror?
No, I don't think so. I mean, it's very different, very distinct. The war on terror was followed, as you know, significant terror attacks. This is something that happened 15 years ago that's been rehashed, but it just adds to a feeling that certain communities, certain Muslims have, that they're under attack, that they're being targeted. I don't think it's that at all. And also, I think we need to remember we had riots in England in August of last year, which were again precipitated by social media, including by X. The vast majority of Brits came out in defense of our communities, our minoritized communities. They stood in front of mosques. They prevented far-right activists and other criminals from trying to break down. So the vast majority of Brits have shown with their hands and their feet how resistant they are to far-right and fascist ideology.
Well said, although Musk is doing his best to normalize it. In fact, last question is one to me, which I'll end with. Marta Worley asks, Mehdi, does Zeteo have a strategy or process for deciding when to cover the Musk manufactured news agenda and when to refuse to give it more oxygen? It's a tricky line to walk, so I asked the question with empathy. Thank you for your empathy, Marta, because I'll tell you what, me and my team, we do struggle with this a lot, not just with Musk, but with Trump. Because there is this classic thing where you don't want to amplify and give attention to these people. I did not want to start the new year having a discussion about Pakistani grooming gangs and the links between Islam and child rape with Nazir Afzal. With the greatest respect to Nazir, that's not how I plan to start my new year. But on the other hand, we can't ignore it either, because Elon Musk is so powerful, so influential, that he's managed to turn British politics upside down in the last few days. There are votes in Parliament happening because of this foreign billionaire sitting in the United States, having right-wing politicians dance to his tune. So to answer your question, Marta, we're going to try and ignore the crazy batshit trolling, attention-seeking stuff, unless and until it becomes dangerous real world. I mean, one classic example, Donald Trump was a few weeks ago joking about Greenland, and yesterday he said he's not ruling out military action against Denmark. So this is the bizarro world we're now in for the next 4 years. Trump plus Musk trolling us daily, and we'll have to work out when to do the fact checks. Zeteo is all about finding the truth, fact checking, defending reality against the trolls and against the people who want to gaslight you. And that's why we did this town hall today, to give you a chance to put your questions to an actual expert who knows what they're talking about. Nazir Afzal, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you so much.
And thank you all for watching at home. Please tell your friends to subscribe to Zateo so they can join town halls like this as paid subscribers, and we can try and push back against all the misinformation and disinformation out there. Have a great rest of your year. Bye-bye.